Nobody at Aurelio's ever learned the name of the woman who mopped its floors. To the crystal chandeliers and the $1,000 bottles of Barolo, she was simply furniture that moved a heavy-set 27-year-old in a gray uniform, 2 sizes too big, dark hair scraped into a tired bun, sneakers squeaking against marble she'd polished 100 times, but would never be allowed to sit on. Her name was Gracie Belandi, and in the most expensive restaurant in Boston's North End, she'd perfected the art of being invisible. She came in after the dinner rush, when the laughter of people who'd never counted $1 in their lives faded into the night, and she left before dawn with aching knees and a debt that never shrank the hospital bills of a grandmother she'd buried only months before, the same grandmother who'd taught her a dying dialect from a village in Calabria most maps had forgotten. Gracie had learned long ago that the world doesn't look twice at women who clean, and the man who owned that restaurant was exactly the kind of man the world looked at far too closely. Tommaso Aurelio was 37, and he wore his suits like armor, and his silence like a loaded gun. The staff didn't meet his eyes. The city's councilmen returned his calls within the hour. Men who crossed the Aurelio name had a way of simply ceasing to be discussed. He was rich in the way that frightens people, powerful in the way that doesn't need to raise its voice, and cold in a way that no amount of money had ever managed to thaw, because the one thing his empire couldn't buy was the only thing he was quietly losing. That night, for the first time in anyone's memory, Tommaso Aurelio walked through his own front doors with an elderly woman on his arm. His mother, Rosa, 68, bird-like, beautiful in the faded way of old photographs, and frightened of a son she no longer always recognized. The room held its breath, because something was wrong with her. Her hands trembled. Her eyes searched the faces of strangers for one she could trust, and the words spilling from her lips were in no language anyone at that gleaming table understood. Bodyguards shifted. A consigliere's hand drifted toward her coat, and the most dangerous man in Boston stood frozen and helpless, a king who could end lives with a phone call but couldn't reach his own mother across a dinner table. Then a mop stopped moving in the corner. What the cleaning woman did next would silence that entire room, and it had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with a language only the dying still remember. If a story about dignity, second chances, and the kindness no fortune can buy is the kind of story that moves you, do hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's step back into Aurelio's, where a forgotten woman is about to remind the most feared man in Boston exactly what it means to be seen. The mop stopped in the corner of the room, and Gracie leaned it quietly against the wall, as though she were afraid of breaking something fragile that was hanging suspended in the air. She wasn't thinking at all, or if she was, it was only the instinctive pull of someone who had once spent hours beside a sickbed, holding the hand of another old woman who had looked at her with eyes just as lost as these. She crossed the marble floor she herself had polished, passing through the cold, sharp stairs of the diners, turning to watch the woman in the gray uniform daring to walk toward the most powerful table in the room, and she knelt down beside Rosa, lowering herself until her eyes were level with the old woman's frightened ones. A bodyguard took half a step forward, his hand already resting lightly beneath the flap of his jacket, but there was something in the way Gracie bowed her head, in the complete gentleness of that posture, that made him freeze. Then Gracie spoke, and the first words that came out were not the proper Italian people were taught in classrooms, but a warm, rough, ancient dialect, the language of villages hidden behind the hillsides of southern Italy, the kind only those born there still carried inside them. "Grandma, don't be afraid. I'm here," Gracie said softly in a Calabrian voice. "No one here is going to hurt you. You're safe now." It was as if someone had drawn every sound out of the room. The faint clink of knives and forks against porcelain plates fell silent. A silver-haired man at the next table lowered his menu. The bodyguard straightened, his confused gaze shifting from Gracie to his boss, and then back to the girl kneeling on the floor. And then the strangest thing happened right in front of them all. Rosa's trembling hands began to slow. The panic in her eyes, the look of a small animal cornered against a wall, started to dissolve like mist beneath sunlight. She tilted her head and listened, as if that sound had touched some deep chamber inside her that illness hadn't yet managed to erase. "You speak the language of our home," Rosa whispered back in that same dialect, her voice breaking midway with emotion. "It's been so long since anyone spoke to me in the language of home." Gracie nodded, and a tender smile bloomed on her lips. "Yes, ma'am, I speak the language of home. Would you like to hear a song?" I'll sing for you." The old woman's wrinkled hand searched through the air and found Gracie's hand, her thin fingers gripping her with surprising strength, the strength of someone who had just found a piece of driftwood in the middle of a vast sea. Gracie didn't pull away. She let the old woman hold on, and she gently squeezed back, her thumb stroking the back of that aged hand in a steady rhythm, the rhythm of someone who knew how to soothe frightened hearts. Around the long table, more than a dozen of the most powerful people in Boston sat motionless. Someone set down a wineglass and forgot to take a sip. Someone else watched the scene with the face of a man witnessing something that reached beyond everything he understood about the world he lived in. And at the head of the table, Tommaso Aurelio stood rooted to the floor. The man whose name made the whole city hold its breath, the man who had never let anyone see him shaken for even a second, was now staring at the nameless cleaning woman from his own restaurant, doing the one thing that months of money, the finest doctors, and all his power had been unable to do. He had brought his mother here so she could have a normal evening, an evening without nurses, without a hospital, only the two of them, mother and son, and he had watched that evening collapse into panic in front of the very people before whom he needed to appear strong. And yet now his mother was smiling. She was smiling at a stranger in a loose, ill-fitting uniform, and her hand, the hand that for weeks had forgotten even how to hold a spoon, was clutching that girl's hand as though holding on to something precious. Tommaso couldn't say a word. His throat tightened around an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time, something that felt both like gratitude and like pain, and he didn't know what to do with it. The whole room was still waiting, and no one dared breathe too loudly, while the girl kneeling on the cold marble floor bowed her head closer to the old woman and began softly humming the first notes of an ancient melody. The melody was very soft, almost nothing more than breath bent into musical notes. An old lullaby Gracie's grandmother had once sung to her every night when she was a child. A humble sound without accompaniment, needing nothing except the love placed inside every word. Gracie sang in the Calabrian dialect, lullaby words about a small river running through a village, about the moon hanging above the olive hills, about a mother sitting by the window waiting for her child, and while she sang, her hand never left Rosa's, her thumb still stroking steadily with the rhythm, as if she were trying to pass peace through each touch. Rosa closed her eyes. The tense lines across her forehead softened little by little, her thin shoulders stopped trembling, and she began to sway faintly with the song like a child being comforted. Then, midway through the song, when Gracie reached the line about the mother by the window, Rosa suddenly began to sing along. Her voice was fragile, broken, forgetting many of the words, but she remembered the melody. She remembered it from a place so deep that the illness couldn't reach it, and the two voices, one old and one young, blended together in the glittering crystal room that now seemed to shrink until it was no larger than a warm kitchen in some faraway village in southern Italy. When the final line faded, Rosa opened her eyes, and she looked at Gracie with an entirely different gaze, a gaze strangely clear, then lifted her trembling hand and touched the girl's cheek. "Lucia," she whispered, a name slipping from her lips as lightly as a falling leaf. "Lucia, you've come back to me." Gracie went still for a heartbeat. She didn't know who Lucia was. She had never heard that name before. But she saw in the old woman's eyes a happiness so pure that she couldn't bear to correct her, and so she only pressed her own hand over the hand resting on her cheek and nodded very softly. "Yes, ma'am, I'm here. I'm here with you." At the head of the table, a tiny sound rose, the faint creak of wood beneath the grip of tightening fingers. Tommaso was holding the back of the chair in front of him, gripping it so hard his knuckles had gone white, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. He watched his mother sing, watched her call the name of someone who wasn't really there, and something inside his chest, that block of ice he had spent his whole life forging, began to crack along a thin but deep line. How long had it been since he had seen his mother so peaceful? How long had it been since he had sat beside her bed in the middle of the night, listening to her call the names of the dead, asking about a home in a country she had left half a century earlier, while he, the man who could make all of Boston tremble in fear, could only sit there in silence because he couldn't reach the woman who had given him life. He had tried everything. He had hired the most expensive specialists in the country, had renovated an entire floor of the mansion into a care suite, had poured money into every treatment modern medicine could offer, and yet not once had he seen on his mother's face the kind of serenity a floor-cleaning girl had just given her with nothing but a song and a hand to hold. Tommaso turned his face away. He didn't want anyone to see, didn't want even the smallest opening to show, but his eyes had grown wet, and he had to draw in a slow, deep breath, forcing the feeling rising in his throat to settle. He wasn't the kind of man who was easily moved. He had taught himself long ago that emotion was a luxury men like him weren't allowed to have. But now, standing in the middle of his own restaurant, he felt more fragile than he had ever been. He glanced at the girl kneeling on the floor, the woman whose existence in his restaurant he hadn't even known about until tonight. And for the first time in many years, Tommaso Aurelio looked at another human being not with an eye for measuring how useful or dangerous they might be, but with something close to wonder. Rosa leaned her head against Gracie's shoulder again, exhausted but peaceful, and the girl kept softly humming, completely unaware that with a single lullaby she had just cracked the shell no one in the entire city had ever managed to touch. Rosa fell asleep on Gracie's shoulder only a few minutes later, her breathing even and relieved like a child exhausted after crying. And Gracie stayed exactly where she was, kneeling on the floor, her back aching badly, but she didn't dare move for fear of waking the old woman. Tommaso signaled to the manager, and in an instant, the whole room began moving again like a machine that had been carefully oiled. The diners returned to their unfinished meals. The murmur of conversation came back to life, but everything happened more softly now, as though no one wanted to break what had just taken place. He stepped forward, bent down, and lifted his mother with a strange and careful tenderness. And in that moment, the man who made an entire city hold its breath looked only like a son cradling the most precious thing in his life. He placed her into the wheelchair his assistant had just brought over, draped a shawl across her shoulders, then turned to Gracie, and for the first time that night, he looked directly into her eyes. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and quiet, no longer carrying the commanding tone that the restaurant staff had learned to fear. "Gracie," she answered. "Gracie Belandi. I work the night cleaning shift here." Tommaso was silent for a moment, his gaze passing over her loose uniform, over her knees reddened from kneeling too long on the cold stone, then returning to her tired but gentle face. "My mother has Alzheimer's," he said, and the words came out with difficulty, as though he had never spoken them aloud to anyone before. "The illness gets worse at night. The doctors call it sundowning syndrome. Once evening comes, she panics. She doesn't recognize me, and some nights she doesn't even know where she is. I brought her here because she once said she missed dinners with people around her, missed the feeling of being among others, but then everything slipped beyond my control, and I didn't know what to do." He stopped, his jaw tightening for a brief moment, and Gracie recognized something that perhaps very few people had ever been allowed to see. That this powerful man, right now, was as lost as a little boy who had misplaced his mother in a crowded market. "You just did what I've paid a great deal of money to many people for, and none of them could do it," he continued. "I want to thank you." Then he reached inside his jacket, pulled out a stack of money, thick bills folded neatly together, and held it out to her. Gracie looked at the money, then looked up at him, and she shook her head. "I won't take it," she said softly but clearly. Tommaso froze, as though he wasn't used to an extended hand being refused. "This is more money than you make in half a year," he said, almost as a reminder. "I know," Gracie replied, "and that's exactly why I won't take it. I didn't sing to her for money. I did it because she was scared, and because no one should have to be that frightened alone. Your mother reminded me of someone I once loved very much, and that's enough." She stood up, her numb legs wavering for one unsteady beat before she found her balance again. Then she bowed her head to the sleeping Rosa, with a respect that made Tommaso look at her for a long time. He held the stack of money in his hand, and suddenly found it heavy and meaningless, the tool he had used all his life to bribe, command, and bend people to his will, for the first time powerless before a floor-cleaning girl in an oversized uniform. There was something in that refusal he couldn't dismiss, a quiet dignity that money couldn't reach, and he stood there, in the middle of his own glittering restaurant, watching the girl return to the corner of the room and pick up the mop as though nothing had happened, while inside his mind, a thought had just begun to kindle, one he himself hadn't yet managed to name. Tommaso didn't let her leave that easily. He followed her, and his voice held her back at the threshold leading into the kitchen. "What song did you sing to my mother?" he asked. "I've never heard that song before." Gracie turned around, a little hesitant. "It's an old lullaby," she replied. "My grandmother sang it to me when I was little. She said it was the song of her village, and no one outside that region knew it." Tommaso frowned, something passing across his face for the briefest moment. "What village?" he asked. "A small village in Calabria," Gracie said, "called Santa Lucia del Monte. It's on a mountainside. My grandmother said it was so small it wasn't on most maps." Tommaso went still. For one long moment, he said nothing, only looked at her with an expression Gracie couldn't read. Then he breathed out, "My mother was born in Santa Lucia del Monte." This time it was Gracie who froze. They both stood there, on the border between the kitchen and the dining room, staring at each other across an invisible thread that had just been tied back together after 60 years. "That can't be," Gracie whispered. "That village only had a few hundred people. My grandmother always said everyone in the whole village knew one another." "What was your grandmother's name?" Tommaso asked, and this time his voice had grown hoarse. "Lucia," Gracie answered. "Lucia Belandi, but her maiden name was Lucia Fontana." Tommaso slowly lifted a hand to his mouth. "Lucia," he repeated. "That's the name my mother called you a moment ago." He took out his phone, searching for something with fingers that were no longer as calm as usual, then turned the screen toward her. It was an old photograph that had been copied and saved, yellowed by the passing years. In it, 2 young women stood side by side in the middle of a stone-paved square, with a small fountain behind them and a church with a leaning bell tower. The 2 girls had their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling brightly beneath the sun. And though the photograph had faded, Gracie still recognized one of those faces, the face she had looked at throughout her childhood in the framed pictures on her grandmother's shelf. "That's my grandmother," she said, her voice trembling. "That's my grandmother when she was young." Tommaso nodded. "The one standing beside her is my mother," he said, "Rosa Aurelio. Back then her name was Rosa Greco. My mother kept this photograph all her life. She always carried it in her wallet, and every time her mind became confused, she would take it out and ask me who the girl beside her was, and why she wasn't here anymore. I never knew who the person in the photograph was until tonight." Gracie lifted a hand to cover her mouth, tears rising before she could stop them. "My grandmother left Italy decades ago when she was just a young girl," she said. "She came to America alone, worked in a sewing factory for decades, and she rarely spoke about home because she said missing it too much hurt. But she always sang that lullaby. Every night, sang it until the day she died." Tommaso looked at the photograph in his hand, then at the girl standing in front of him, and they both understood something no words could ever fully hold, that the 2 women in that picture, the 2 girls who had once stood singing together in the village square on a Calabrian afternoon 6 decades earlier, had unknowingly woven the thread of fate that pulled one woman's granddaughter and the other woman's son together in a restaurant in Boston. "My mother once told me," Tommaso said slowly, "that when she was young, she had a best friend. The 2 of them often stood singing in the square every Sunday evening, and people called them the 2 nightingales of the village. Then that friend left to seek a new life across the ocean, and they lost contact. Letters gradually went missing, and my mother always said she regretted all her life that she hadn't been able to keep that friend." Gracie broke down, a soft sob catching in her throat. "Because my grandmother said the same thing," she choked out. "She said she had left her dearest friend behind in their homeland and never found her again." Tommaso quietly put away his phone, and when he lifted his eyes to look at her, his gaze was completely different. No longer the measuring stare of a crime boss, but the gaze of a man who had just realized that fate had placed in his hands something money could never buy. 3 days later, Tommaso had someone find Gracie and invite her to a quiet cafe in the North End, a discreet place with old wooden tables and the rich smell of dark roasted coffee, where he was already sitting and waiting without bodyguards hovering close by as they usually did. He went straight to the point. "I want to hire you," he said, "not to clean anymore, but to care for my mother. She needs someone beside her when the episodes come, someone who can speak the language of her home, someone she trusts, and that night I saw her trust you in a way she's never trusted any nurse I've ever hired." He named an amount, a salary many times higher than what she earned from both shifts combined, enough for her to pay off the medical debt that was choking her, enough for her to stop dragging herself back to her damp rented room at daybreak with both knees aching. Gracie didn't answer right away. She looked at the cup of coffee slowly cooling in front of her, and inside her was a real struggle. She knew who Tommaso Aurelio was, or at least she knew what people whispered about him, about people who disappeared, about the name no one dared say too loudly, and one part of her screamed that stepping into this man's world meant stepping into a place where she might never find her way out. But then she thought of Rosa, of the wrinkled hand gripping hers as if it were the only lifeline left in a vast, dark ocean, of the name Lucia slipping from the old woman's lips like a prayer, of the photograph of two girls singing in the village square, when now she knew one of them was her own grandmother. She thought that if she refused, Rosa would go through those nights of panic alone again, calling out the name of a dead friend in a room full of strangers. "I'll accept," she finally said, "but not because of the money. Because of her. I'll care for her the way I cared for my own grandmother. That's the only thing I can promise you." Tommaso nodded. And in that moment, something softened in his usually cold eyes. What neither of them saw was that at a table far away, hidden behind a partition curtain, two other people were watching this meeting. Carlo Aurelio, Tommaso's cousin, sat stirring his espresso with an unreadable expression, his narrowed eyes observing the girl in plain clothes sitting across from the head of the family. "Who is she?" Carlo asked quietly, and the woman beside him answered in a voice so flat it sent a chill through the air. It was Bianca Russo, Tommaso's trusted advisor, the woman who always dressed in dark colors and always knew more than she said. "A cleaning girl," Bianca replied. "Nothing more and nothing less. But she did what our whole pack of doctors couldn't do with the old woman." Carlo let out a laugh. "Then what's there to worry about? Just a girl who knows how to soothe a sick person." Bianca didn't laugh with him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Gracie, and when she spoke, her voice carried something sharp, as a blade hidden in velvet. "The thing to worry about," she said slowly, "isn't what that girl can do for the old woman. It's what she can do to Tommaso. A man like him has spent years letting no one touch him, and now he personally invites a floor-cleaning girl to sit down for coffee without bringing even one bodyguard. When a man starts growing soft-hearted, he starts leaving openings, and openings always come with a price." She took a sip of coffee, her eyes never leaving the unsuspecting girl talking with the crime boss at the other end of the room, then added in a voice light as air and cold as ice, "I'll find out who this girl really is." Carlo glanced at her, a little surprised by the seriousness in her tone, but he only shrugged and drained his coffee, never knowing that the woman sitting beside him had just begun weaving the first threads of a net that he himself would one day be caught in. The Aurelio mansion stood at the end of a tree-shaded road on the outskirts of Boston, hidden behind towering iron gates and a long stone wall that seemed to have no end, and the first time Gracie stepped inside, she felt as though she had crossed the boundary between two worlds. Inside was a kind of luxury so overwhelming it nearly stole the breath. Gleaming marble floors, oil paintings in gilded frames, crystal chandeliers even more magnificent than the ones at the restaurant, but all of it carried a strange coldness, the chill of a place too vast for too little love. There was no laughter in this house, no trace of ordinary life, only men in dark suits standing silently at the corners of the hallways, nodding to her with guarded politeness and following every step she took with professional eyes. Gracie was led upstairs to the floor, reserved for Rosa, a space carefully renovated with every medical convenience, and there she found the only warmth in the entire house, the old woman sitting by the window looking out at the garden, her face lighting up when she saw her. The first days passed in a quiet rhythm. Gracie learned how to read the waves inside Rosa's mind, knowing when she needed a song, when she only needed a hand to hold, when she had wandered back into the past and needed to be guided gently home again. But the longer she stayed in the mansion, the more clearly she sensed the underworld moving beneath that elegant shell. One afternoon, while looking for warm water for Rosa, she accidentally turned down the wrong hallway on the lower floor and heard voices coming from behind the half-closed door of the study. It was Tommaso's voice, low and level, but carrying a force that made a chill run down her spine. "I already told you," he said. "Your people aren't to come anywhere near that area again. This time I'll let it pass. Next time, I won't promise to stay polite." Another man answered something she couldn't make out, and then, through the crack in the door, she saw Tommaso leaning against the desk, and on the desktop, lying casually beside a glass of liquor, was a black handgun with a polished shine. Gracie quickly stepped back, her heart pounding hard, and hurried upstairs again, reminding herself that she had come here for Rosa, that whatever happened behind those doors was not her business. But that image haunted her, not exactly because of the gun, but because of Tommaso's face in that moment, a face lonely to the very core, the face of a man standing in the middle of his own empire, with no one at all to lean on. That evening, while she was taking Rosa for a walk along the hallway, she saw Bianca Russo standing at the far end, half hidden in shadow, watching in silence. The woman said nothing, only inclined her head in greeting with a smile that never reached her eyes. But the way her gaze traveled over Gracie made her feel as though she had just been weighed and measured from head to toe. "You take very good care of her," Bianca said, her voice smooth as velvet. "Tommaso values you. That's rare, you know. He never values anyone." Then she walked away, her heels striking evenly against the stone floor, leaving behind a heavy silence that made Gracie hold Rosa's hand more tightly. That night, after Rosa had fallen deeply asleep, Gracie stood by the window of her room and looked down at the dark garden, and she saw Tommaso standing alone among the gravel paths. No bodyguards, no phone, only one solitary figure beneath the cold moonlight. He stood there for a long time, motionless, like a statue forgotten in his own garden, and Gracie suddenly understood that the man who owned all of this was in truth living inside a magnificent prison built by his own hands. A prison whose four walls were the fear he had planted in other people's hearts. And the price he paid was that no one dared come close enough to see that he knew loneliness too. Gracie realized that Tommaso always avoided his mother when her mind became confused. Not because he didn't love her, but because he was afraid of that helpless feeling of being looked at by his own mother as though he were a stranger. And so one afternoon, she decided to pull him in, instead of letting him remain outside. "Sit down here with us," she said when he had just stopped by Rosa's room and was about to withdraw as he always did. "She's happy right now. This is the best time to be with her." Tommaso hesitated, a rare awkwardness passing over his face, but then he pulled out a chair and sat down, clumsy as a man unaccustomed to tenderness. Gracie began playing an old recording, Calabrian folk melodies she had found, and she set a plate of food she had cooked herself on the table. Filea served with tomato sauce and hot peppers in the true southern Italian way, the kind of flavor Rosa had grown up with. As soon as the aroma spread through the room, the old woman's eyes lit up, and she began to tell them, in that warm, deep dialect, about the afternoons when her mother used to cook this dish over a wood-burning stove, about the smell of smoke, about the sound of children running and playing in the square. Gracie looked over at Tommaso. "Ask her more," she said softly. "She's inside a beautiful memory. Step into it with her." Tommaso hesitated. Then, in a rough, awkward voice, he asked his mother in Italian, "Mom, back then did Grandma put a lot of peppers in this dish?" And Rosa turned to her son, smiling brightly as if she had just recognized him. "Oh, plenty," she replied. "If you ate it, it would make you cry." And then she laughed. A clear laugh Tommaso hadn't heard in many months. Something broke open inside his chest, but this time it wasn't pain. It was a strange warmth he didn't know how to handle. In the days that followed, Gracie patiently taught him, not through lectures, but by example. She showed him never to correct Rosa when she remembered something wrong, never to try dragging her back into reality with painful reminders, but to step into her world, to meet her in the very place where her mind had wandered. She taught him that music and scent could open doors words couldn't, that sometimes what Rosa needed was not a correct answer, but only a hand to hold and a presence that did not judge her. And Tommaso, a man used to giving orders and being obeyed, learned for the first time in his life how to listen instead of command, how to be gentle instead of controlling. He began visiting his mother's room more often, sometimes only sitting quietly while he listened to Gracie sing, sometimes feeding Rosa spoonful by spoonful with his own hand. And each time, Gracie saw the hard shell around him grow a little thinner, but she wasn't naive. She still saw him take calls midway through and leave with his face gone rigid, still saw dark-dressed men come and go, still felt the underworld that never stopped operating beneath this roof. The gentle man sitting beside his mother's bed and the cold man behind the study door were the same person. And Gracie understood that she couldn't pretend the other half of him didn't exist. One evening, as he stood silently watching his mother sleep, he said softly without turning toward her, "I'd forgotten she used to laugh like that. It's been so long that I couldn't even remember the sound of my own mother's laughter anymore." Gracie stood beside him in the gentle darkness of the room, and she answered quietly, "She's still in there, you know. The illness is only hiding her. It hasn't taken her away. You just have to learn how to find your way to her." Tommaso turned to look at her, and in his gaze there was something both grateful and bewildered, the look of a man slowly realizing that this girl was quietly opening doors inside him he had thought were closed forever. The old wound returned to Gracie on an afternoon that had seemed peaceful, as she sat sorting through her grandmother's medical bills, trying to negotiate the last remaining debt now that she finally had the means to pay it. She went through each bill, each transfer document, and her eyes stopped on a name printed faintly in the corner of one page. The name of the company that managed the care facility where her grandmother had spent the final months of her life. A private nursing home her family had once believed was the best choice within their reach. That name felt strangely familiar, and an uneasy instinct made her pick up her phone and search. Layer after layer of information appeared. The parent company, then the parent company of that parent company. A chain of legal entities nested inside one another like wooden dolls, and at the very end of that chain, hidden behind intermediary names built to conceal it, there was a real estate investment corporation. She had heard mentioned far too many times over the past several days. A name tied to the Aurelio family. Gracie sat frozen in her chair, the paper trembling in her hand. She remembered her grandmother's final months, remembered the way the nursing home had suddenly cut staff, remembered the times she had called and begged them to assign more nurses, only to receive cold refusals in return, remembered the morning they told her that her grandmother had died from a complication that could have been caught early if someone had been there to watch over her. Back then, she had blamed fate, blamed her own poverty, blamed the cruel reality that people without money couldn't buy decent care. But now, sitting inside the very mansion of the family that owned that nursing home, she began to see everything under a different light, cold and terrible. She remembered Tommaso once mentioning in passing that his organization controlled many medical facilities and nursing homes, using them as machines for generating cash flow. And she remembered the way he spoke of cutting costs and optimizing profit, in the tone of a man who had never thought about the human beings lying behind every number on a balance sheet. A chill ran down her spine. Had the indifference for profit of this very empire helped send her grandmother away in loneliness and neglect? Was the man she was helping day after day, the man she was allowing herself to feel something for, actually one link in the machine that had taken the person she loved most from her? Gracie pressed her hand over her mouth, holding back a sob. She had no proof that Tommaso had personally made any decision. She didn't know whether he had even known about the small nursing home where her grandmother had died, but that possibility alone was enough to break her heart. She looked around the luxurious room, looked out into the hallway, where Rosa was sleeping peacefully under the devoted care Gracie gave her, and a bitter irony rose inside her, that she was caring for the mother of the man whose organization might have abandoned her grandmother to death. She didn't sleep at all that night. She sat beside the window, tears running silently down her face, and inside her was a struggle with no way out. One part of her wanted to pack her things and leave at once, wanted to run from this house and from the terrible truth she had just discovered, wanted never to look at Tommaso Aurelio's face again. But then she thought of Rosa, of the way the old woman held her hand every night, of the name Lucia she called as if calling a friend back from a distant world, of the thread of fate that had joined Gracie's grandmother and this aging mother across 60 years and 2 shores of the ocean. If she left, Rosa would sink back into those lonely nights of panic, and Rosa had done nothing wrong in any of this. Gracie wrapped her arms around herself in the darkness, torn between old pain and new compassion, between the anger beginning to kindle and a feeling she didn't dare name, and she understood that no matter what she chose, her heart would bleed. The anger simmering inside Gracie for the past few days finally broke free one evening, when she happened to hear Tommaso speaking on the phone in the study about shutting down an underperforming care facility, his voice indifferent, as if he were discussing a piece of leftover inventory that needed to be cleared out. She stood at the threshold, and before she could stop herself, she spoke. "Do you ever think about the people who live in those facilities?" Tommaso looked up, surprised by the sharpness in her voice. He ended the call and set the phone down on the desk, beside the gun she had seen before. "It's business," he replied calmly. "Some places don't make a profit, so they have to be closed. That's how things work." Gracie stepped into the room, her hands clenched tight. "Business," she repeated, her voice trembling as she tried to hold herself together. "Do you know? My grandmother died in a care facility, a small nursing home where staffing had been cut so deeply there was no one left to watch over the residents. She died alone because of a complication that could have been caught if just one nurse had been paying attention. And I just found out that facility belonged to your organization." The room went silent. Tommaso's face hardened for a moment, and his first instinct was to defend himself. "I don't know which facility you're talking about," he said. "My organization controls dozens of places like that. I can't know every single name." "Exactly," Gracie nodded, tears beginning to roll down her face. "You don't know, because to you they're only numbers on paper, money moving in and out, and you never have to look into the faces of the people behind those numbers. But to me, it was my grandmother, the woman who raised me, the woman who sang me to sleep every night, the only person in this world who loved me without condition. She died alone so your empire could earn a few more dollars in profit. Tommaso stood up, a flash of anger in his eyes, the reflex of a man unaccustomed to being accused inside his own home. "You don't understand the world I live in," he said, his voice going hard. "In that world, the weak get crushed, and the strong survive. I built everything I have by making people respect me and fear me." Gracie looked straight into his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Respect," she said softly. "You're confusing those two things. Your power can buy fear, but it can never buy respect. People bow their heads to you because they're afraid, not because they respect you. Do you know the difference? Fear disappears the moment you turn your back, but respect remains." She stopped, wiped away her tears, then went on in a voice gentler, but even more painful. "Look at your mother. She doesn't remember that you're a powerful boss. The illness has erased all of that from her mind. What she still remembers are kind people, a song, a hand holding hers when she's frightened. She remembers love, not fear. So when you have nothing left, when all this power is gone, the only thing people will remember about you is how you treated other human beings." Tommaso stood frozen. The anger inside him slowly cooled, giving way to something he didn't want to admit, a crack in the argument he had spent his whole life using to justify the man he had become. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out, because somewhere deep inside, he knew she was right. He thought of his mother, who still remembered love inside a mind that was breaking apart, and he wondered that if one day he too forgot everything, what would be left inside him. "I'm very sorry about your grandmother," he finally said, and this time there was no defense left in his voice, only the bare truth. "I'll find out what really happened. I owe you that." Gracie looked at him for a long time, then turned and walked out, leaving behind a man who, for the first time in his life, was standing face to face with the real cost of everything he had built. After that evening of confrontation, something changed between them, a new guardedness mixed with a closeness neither of them dared to name. Tommaso began lingering longer in his mother's room, and Gracie realized he no longer came there only because of Rosa. He would sit in the corner, quietly watching her brush the old woman's hair, listening as she told small, ordinary stories in a gentle voice he had never heard anyone use under this roof. And sometimes he caught himself smiling without even knowing it. One evening, after Rosa had fallen asleep, he invited her out onto the balcony for a cup of tea, and they stood there in silence, looking down at the garden submerged in darkness. "You're not afraid of me," he said suddenly. Not as a question, but almost as an expression of wonder. "Everyone is afraid of me, even the people who've been with me for years, but you aren't." Gracie took a sip of tea. "I'm afraid of what you can do," she answered honestly, "but I'm not afraid of who you are. Those are different things." Tommaso turned to look at her, and in the pale golden light spilling from the window, he saw that her face held no calculation, not a single crease of fear or flattery, only a bare honesty that both unsettled him and drew him in. All his life, he had lived among people who were always hiding, always calculating, always saying what he wanted to hear, and this girl, in her old uniform with her calloused hands, was the only one who dared tell him the truth, dared look at him without seeing a crime boss, seeing only a human being. There was a kind of light in her, a warmth nothing had managed to extinguish no matter how cruelly life had treated her, and Tommaso, who had grown so used to living in darkness that he had begun to believe he belonged to it, found himself pulled toward that light in a way he couldn't resist. "You remind me of a version of myself I lost a long time ago," he said quietly. "Back when I was a boy, before all of this." Gracie looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to see not the shell, but the person underneath, the boy who had once grown up in poverty, beside a mother who sang lullabies in the Calabrian dialect, the man who had traded away his soul so he would never have to be weak again, and who was now lonely to the very core inside the empire he had built with his own hands. She felt a gentle and dangerous pull toward him, a feeling she knew she shouldn't have, a feeling torn apart by everything she had just learned about her grandmother's death. His hand happened to rest near hers on the stone railing, and for one moment, the distance between their hands was only an inch or two, a small emptiness they were both aware of, both feeling the pull inside it. Gracie was the one who drew her hand back first. She tightened her grip around the teacup. "I should go check on Rosa," she said softly, her voice slightly unsteady. Tommaso nodded and did not stop her. But as she walked away, he called after her, "Thank you, Gracie. Not for taking care of my mother, but for treating me like a human being." She paused for one beat at the doorway, without turning around, then continued on, leaving her heart to pound wildly inside her chest. That night, she lay awake, torn between reason and emotion, between the gentle man beside his mother's bed and the cold empire that had taken her grandmother from her, between the light she had unknowingly kindled in his eyes and the darkness she knew he still hadn't stepped out of. She understood that she was standing on a fragile boundary, and that with every day she remained in this house, that boundary became harder to hold. While Tommaso allowed himself to soften day by day under Gracie's quiet influence, other eyes were watching that change with cold calculation. Carlo Aurelio met Don Falcone in an abandoned warehouse by the waterfront, where the smell of sea salt and machine oil mingled in the darkness, and there he laid out his ambition before the head of the family that had long been the Aurelio line's enemy. "Tommaso isn't the Tommaso he used to be," Carlo said, his voice full of contempt that barely concealed his hunger. "He spends all day at the bedside of his senile mother, lets a floor-cleaning girl come and go from the mansion as if she belongs there, neglects his work, abandons his business dealings, and his own men are starting to whisper, 'This is the best time to act, and I need you.'" Don Falcone, an older man with a weathered face and the eyes of someone who had survived many wars, took a sip of liquor and looked at Carlo with suspicion. "And why should I trust a man willing to betray his own blood?" he asked. Carlo gave a faint, cold laugh. "Because blood means nothing when Tommaso has always treated me like someone beneath him. I've waited too long for what should have been mine, and you've wanted Aurelio territory for years. We both have something we want." The two men shook hands in the dark, a handshake sealed by greed and betrayal, and the plan began to take shape, to strike a decisive blow at the exact moment Tommaso was distracted and off guard. But there was one thing Carlo didn't know, that every step he took had already been calculated by someone else first. Inside the Aurelio mansion, Bianca Russo sat alone in her private office, the desk lamp casting light across her sharp, cold face as she scrolled through encrypted messages on a phone no one in the family knew she owned. She had been watching Carlo for weeks, had known about his meetings with Falcone, had every detail of the conspiracy beginning to form in her hands, and yet she hadn't reported any of it to Tommaso. Instead, she smiled, a thin, cold smile, and typed a short message to a hidden number. There are men who think they're controlling the game without knowing they're only pawns, and Bianca understood that better than anyone. The next morning, she came to Tommaso with a carefully measured look of concern, and in her familiar velvet voice, she planted expertly calculated seeds of doubt in his ear. "I'm worried about you," she said. "People outside have been talking a great deal lately about how you've changed, about that girl. You know, in our world, soft-heartedness is seen as weakness, and weakness invites enemies." Tommaso frowned. "What are you implying?" he asked. Bianca gave an elegant shrug. "I'm only reminding you to protect yourself," she replied. "And by the way, that girl, are you sure she came here only because of Rosa? A stranger suddenly appears at exactly the right time, knows exactly the right language, does exactly the things that make you soften. Sometimes a coincidence, this perfect isn't really a coincidence." Her words were like a poisoned needle, designed both to make Tommaso doubt Gracie and to keep him from doubting Bianca herself. Tommaso remained silent, his face unreadable, and Bianca knew she had planted the seed she wanted. She left the room with an unhurried stride, quietly satisfied, because while Carlo believed he was guiding the game, and Tommaso believed danger came only from the outside, she, the woman who always stood in the shadows with an air of absolute loyalty, was the one silently tightening every thread of the net around all of them. And upstairs in the mansion, completely unaware of the storm drawing near, Gracie sat by the window singing a lullaby to Rosa, her voice drifting gently through the room, a small island of peace soon to be swallowed whole. The storm came on a moonless night. Gracie was sitting beside Rosa's bed, having just finished the final line of the lullaby, when the lights in the mansion suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the room. She froze, her heart pounding hard, and then she heard it. A dry, sharp explosion rising from downstairs. Then the sound of shattering glass, the thunder of running footsteps, shouting voices. Rosa startled awake and began to panic, and Gracie immediately knelt beside her, gripping her hand tightly. "Shh, Grandma," I'm here. I'm here with you," she whispered in the Calabrian dialect, trying to keep her voice calm, though fear was trembling inside her. Downstairs, gunfire cracked in short bursts, hard and decisive, mixed with the sounds of bodies falling and furniture crashing over. Gracie understood at once that this wasn't an accident. Someone was attacking the mansion. She helped Rosa out of bed, drew her into the most hidden corner of the room behind a large wooden cabinet, and used her own body to shield the trembling old woman. Heavy footsteps came up the stairs, closer and closer. The bedroom door burst open. 2 men dressed in black, their faces covered, rushed in with guns held ready, flashlights sweeping across the room until the beams stopped on the 2 women huddled in the corner. "Found them," one man growled. Gracie held Rosa tighter, covering almost the old woman's whole body with her own. "Don't touch her," she said, her voice breaking but firm. "She's sick. She has nothing to do with this." The man came closer, grabbed Gracie by the arm, and yanked her away, and by instinct, she fought back, not to save herself, but to keep from being separated from Rosa. In the struggle, the butt of his gun swung up and came down against her temple. A blinding burst of pain exploded through Gracie's head. Hot blood ran down her cheek, and the world swayed before her eyes. But she didn't let go of Rosa's hand. Even as she staggered, she still tried to reach back toward the old woman, still tried to make her own body a shield. "Enough," the other man said. "The order is to take the girl alive. Use her as leverage. Don't kill her." They dragged Gracie to her feet, one man twisting her arms behind her back, and through the fog of pain she still turned to look back at Rosa, who was curled in the corner, sobbing, calling Lucia's name in terror. "You'll be all right," Gracie tried to call back in Italian, though her voice had grown weak. "Stay there. Someone will come. Don't be afraid." Just then, the gunfire downstairs thinned out and stopped, and a voice rang from the stairway. A voice Gracie recognized even with her head spinning. Tommaso. He appeared at the threshold, his shirt smeared with someone else's blood, his eyes sweeping the room before going rigid at the sight in front of him, his mother curled in the corner, and Gracie bleeding heavily at the temple, held captive by 2 men. In that instant, Tommaso's face changed into something primal and terrifying, but he didn't fire, because one of the men had pressed the muzzle of a gun to Gracie's head. "Step back," the man shouted, "or the girl dies." Tommaso stood still, his hands slowly lifting, his gaze locked on Gracie, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Boston revealed naked fear. Not fear for himself, but fear of losing the girl standing there covered in blood. "Let her go," he said, his voice hoarse and thick. "Whatever you want. Money, territory, I'll give you everything. But let them both go." The man sneered, shook his head, and dragged Gracie backward toward the window, where an escape route had already been prepared. Gracie looked at Tommaso through tears and blood. And even in that moment of danger, the worry that slipped from her mouth was, "Rosa, please take care of Rosa." Then they pulled her away into the darkness, leaving Tommaso rooted in the middle of the room, with his elderly mother crying behind him, and a storm of rage and terror rising up to drown him. The footsteps of the kidnappers dissolved into the night beyond the window, and Tommaso lunged forward to chase after them, but his mother's sobbing pulled him back. Rosa was still curled in the corner of the room, trembling, and he knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her in the darkness, now lit only by the broken beams of flashlights from his men who had just rushed upstairs. "Mom," he called softly, his voice breaking. I'm here now." He thought she would look at him with that distant, unfamiliar gaze the way she had on so many other nights, that she would call him by a name that wasn't his. But in the middle of that chaos, something strange happened. Rosa lifted her head, and her clouded, lost eyes suddenly became clear again. A rare moment of lucidity shining through the fog of illness like sunlight breaking through a heavy bank of clouds. She looked straight at him, and for the first time in many months, she called him by the right name. "Tommaso," she whispered. "My son." He choked up, his whole body going rigid. "Mom, you recognize me?" Rosa raised her wrinkled, trembling hand and pressed it to his cheek, just as she had once touched Gracie's cheek on that first night in the restaurant. "I always recognize you," she said. "Even when I forget everything else, there is a part of me that always knows you are my flesh and blood." Tears rolled down the face of the man the whole city feared, and he didn't bother wiping them away. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I'm sorry I wasn't with you more. Sorry I left you alone for so many years." Rosa shook her head, her eyes still holding that fragile clarity. "Listen to me, son," she said, her voice weak but clear. "I'm proud of you, but not because of the things you have, not because of money or power or the name that makes people afraid. I'm proud because you still know how to love. I've seen you beside my bed. I've seen you learn how to be gentle again." She stopped, breathing with difficulty, then tightened her hand around his. "Don't live alone the way I did, Tommaso. All my life, I left behind the people I loved, my dearest friend, and I lived with that regret until it ate me away from the inside. Don't let power turn you into an island. That kind girl, the one who sang to me in the language of home, don't lose her. Do you hear me? Don't lose someone who dares to love you sincerely." Tommaso gripped his mother's hand, every word from her slicing into the deepest place inside him, the place he had buried for so many years. "I'll find her, Mom," he said, his voice hardening through his tears. "I promise you, I'll bring her back safely." Rosa smiled, a tired but satisfied smile. Then the light in her eyes began to fade, the moment of lucidity passing as quickly as it had come, and she drifted back into that familiar land of mist, her gaze turning vague again. "Lucia," she murmured. "Where is Lucia? Why is the girl crying?" Tommaso held his mother close, and this time, he didn't try to drag her back to reality. He did exactly as Gracie had taught him. He stepped into her world. "Lucia is all right, Mom," he said softly in Italian. "I'll bring her home, don't worry." Rosa nodded, reassured, resting her head against her son's shoulder. Tommaso sat there in the darkness, holding his trembling old mother, and inside him, something had changed for good. His mother's words echoed through his mind. "Don't lose someone who dares to love you sincerely." And he knew, with all the certainty of a man who had just faced the thought of the most precious thing slipping from his grasp, that he would set the whole city ablaze if he had to, just to bring Gracie back. Tommaso entrusted his mother to the loyal housekeeper, and immediately summoned his most faithful men. And in the study still littered with the traces of the attack, he began following every lead. His people quickly confirmed that the assault team bore the marks of the Falcone family, and another name soon surfaced from the statement of a wounded attacker who had been captured, Carlo. Rage surged through Tommaso when he heard the name of his cousin, his own blood, but something didn't fit, and it made him stop short. Carlo was greedy and resentful. That much he knew. But Carlo wasn't clever enough to arrange an attack this precise. Not capable enough to know exactly when the power would be cut, which escape route had been prepared, and most important of all, how the attackers knew exactly which room Gracie was in, knew that taking her hostage would be the most effective leverage. Someone inside had given them information. He ordered a quiet investigation, and as the pieces slowly came into view, a chilling truth began to take shape. The person who had negotiated between Carlo and Falcone, the person who had arranged the timing, the person who had leaked the mansion's layout and Gracie's schedule, all of it led back to one person, the person no one would ever have thought of, the one who had always stood right beside him with the appearance of absolute loyalty. Bianca Russo. When the truth came to light, Tommaso remembered everything with a clarity so sharp it felt almost terrifying, as if someone had rewound the whole film before his eyes. He remembered the night at the restaurant when his mother had panicked, and while everyone stood stunned, there had been one hand quietly moving toward the flap of a jacket where a weapon was hidden. Bianca's hand, not to protect anyone, but as the reflex of someone who was always ready for any situation that might serve her. He remembered the way she had been the first to plant doubt about Gracie in his ear, skillfully steering every suspicion away from herself. He remembered where she had been at every crucial moment, always close enough to gather information, always far enough away not to be suspected. Bianca wasn't Carlo's pawn, and she wasn't Falcone's ally. She had manipulated them both. She had fanned Carlo's ambition, turning him into the supposed mastermind so that if everything collapsed, he would be the one to take the blame. She had joined hands with Falcone, promising him territory, but in truth she was only using his forces to weaken both Tommaso and Carlo, so that when both men fell, she would be the only one left standing among the ashes, holding the entire Aurelio Empire in her hands, without ever firing a single shot under her own name. It was a plot woven with years of patience, by a woman everyone had regarded as a loyal shadow. A woman who had learned that real power didn't belong to the person sitting on the throne, but to the one pulling the strings behind the curtain. Tommaso stood motionless in the study, every vein in his body burning, not only because of the betrayal, but because he realized she had used the softest place inside him, his love for his mother and for Gracie, as a weapon against him. She had calculated that a Tommaso who had begun to soften would be a Tommaso easier to bring down, and she had been half right, because love had indeed made him vulnerable. But she had been wrong about one thing. She had failed to understand that the very same love had now become the thing that made him more dangerous than ever. A man with nothing left to lose was frightening, but a man who had just found something worth protecting and was about to lose it was far more terrifying. He clenched his hand into a fist, his eyes hardening into ice. He knew Bianca believed she had won, that she was waiting for Gracie to be used as a hostage to force him into a corner, waiting for Carlo and Falcone to destroy each other. But Bianca had forgotten one piece on the board, the piece she had always looked down on, a floor-cleaning girl with a heart that neither she nor this entire empire could ever understand, and a man ready to break every rule he had ever lived by in order to save her. Tommaso turned to his men, his voice cold and sharp as steel. "Find out where they're holding her," he ordered, "and get the cars ready. We're going to bring Gracie home." On the way to the place where Gracie was being held, an old warehouse in the port district that his men had just traced, Tommaso sat motionless in the darkness of the armored car, and inside his mind there were none of the familiar tactical calculations, only a comparison that made his heart ache. On one side was Carlo, the man who carried the same blood, the man with whom he had shared a childhood, whom he had supported in business, whom he had trusted like a brother, and yet he had sold him out in exchange for power. On the other side was Gracie, a stranger who owed him nothing, a girl whose grandmother might even have died because of his organization, and yet when a gun was pressed to her head, the final worry that escaped her lips was not for her own life, but for his mother's safety. She had used her own body to shield Rosa, had taken the butt of a gun to the head and still hadn't let go of the old woman's hand. That contrast laid bare a truth Tommaso had denied all his life, that blood did not create loyalty, and power could not buy the kind of love that girl gave so unconditionally. As the car moved through the dark streets, Tommaso made a call and ordered his men to immediately reinvestigate everything about the nursing home where Gracie's grandmother had died, and the answer that came back only made the picture clearer. The staff cuts at the smaller care facilities had been approved under the name of cost optimization by the very finance division Bianca supervised, one of countless decisions she had pushed through on her own without ever bringing them to him. Decisions that to her were only numbers, but to some family somewhere were an entire human life. Tommaso closed his eyes, bitterness rising inside him. He wasn't innocent, he knew that, because he himself had built an empire where profit was placed above people, where people like Bianca were handed the power to decide life and death through spreadsheets. He hadn't personally given the order that killed Gracie's grandmother, but he had created the world that allowed it to happen, and that was a truth he couldn't run from. This wasn't something that could be erased with an apology or a check. He understood that. And he also understood that if he wanted to become the man his mother could be proud of, the man Gracie could look at without seeing the person who had ruined her life, then he would have to bear real responsibility, not simply place all the blame on Bianca and wash his hands clean. The car stopped some distance from the warehouse. Tommaso stepped out, and before signaling his men to move in, he paused for a heartbeat, a final decision taking shape inside him. All his life, he had solved things with violence and blood, and this time he would still do what had to be done to save Gracie. But he promised himself this would be the last time he let this world define who he was. He didn't charge in like blind fury. He ordered his men to make the girl inside their absolute priority, not to let even a stray bullet touch her, and he himself would be the one to bring her out. One of his men asked why the boss would risk his own life for someone who wasn't blood, and Tommaso looked at him for a moment before answering, "Because she risked her life for my mother when she had no reason to do it. And someone like that is worth everything I have to trade." He drew his gun, chambered around, and in the moment before he stepped into the darkness of the warehouse, Tommaso Aurelio was no longer a crime boss coming to reclaim stolen property, but a man going to take back the only precious thing left in his life. And this time, the price he was willing to pay was not someone else's life, but the old self he had once been. Tommaso's men swept into the warehouse from several directions at once, fast and clean, and the gunfire rang out only briefly before Falcone's hired hands understood they had been completely overwhelmed. Tommaso moved through the smoke with a terrifying calm, his eyes scanning the space until he found Gracie, tied to a chair in the far corner, dried blood still marking her temple but her mind still clear, and when their eyes met, what he saw in hers was not accusation, but relief. He went to her first, untied her with his own hands, and draped his coat over her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, and she shook her head. "I'm all right. How is Rosa?" That question, even now, was still about his mother. And something inside Tommaso's chest tightened. Only after Gracie was safe behind him did he turn to deal with the rest. Carlo was dragged out, his face pale as ash, and he dropped to his knees, begging, "Tommaso, we're brothers. We're blood, please." Tommaso looked at his cousin for a long time, and the anger inside him was strong enough to end the man right there, which was exactly what his old self would certainly have done. But he thought of his mother's words, thought of Gracie's eyes watching from behind him, and he lowered the gun. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice cold but not shouting. "And the price for that is that you'll be stripped from this family, lose everything you ever had, and disappear from Boston forever. If I ever see your face again, I won't show mercy a second time." It was a heavy punishment, but it wasn't death, and everyone who witnessed it understood that Tommaso had just done something no one had ever seen before. As for Falcone's hired men, those who had only taken the work to earn their bread, he ordered them released after their weapons were confiscated. "Go back and tell the others that the Aurelio family doesn't slaughter men who only know how to follow orders," he said. "Go find another road to live by." Don Falcone himself, the old man who had sat down to negotiate once he realized the game had turned against him, was given terms by Tommaso that were harsh, but left him a way out with honor. Tommaso laid out the absolute leverage he now held over Falcone's supply lines, a cold chess move that forced the old man to accept a permanent retreat without driving him so deep into a corner that vengeance would become his only choice, successfully ending a war between two families that had already lasted for years. Then there was Bianca. She was found trying to escape, and when she was brought before Tommaso, she did not beg the way Carlo had. She only looked at him with cold eyes touched by contempt. "So you choose the floor-cleaning girl over your empire," she said. "You're weaker than I thought." Tommaso looked at the woman who had stood beside him for years, the one who had exploited his trust, had indirectly caused Gracie's grandmother's death through cold decisions made on paper, had nearly taken both his mother and the woman he loved from him. "You're wrong," he replied. "Before this, I was the weak one, weak enough to think that spreading fear was strength. He did not kill her, though every rule of his world demanded it. Instead, he handed over all the evidence of her criminal operations, carefully gathered, through channels that would force her to face the law and lose every hidden ally she had, a downfall more humiliating than death for someone who craved power the way she did. When it was all over, the warehouse sank into silence, and Tommaso turned back toward Gracie, who had witnessed everything. He knew she had just seen him inside his world, violent, powerful, and ruled by survival. But she had also seen something else. A man choosing restraint instead of slaughter for the first time, choosing justice instead of blind revenge. And in the way she looked at him, mingled with shock, there was a glimmer of something he had believed he would never deserve. The weeks that followed passed in a quietness the Aurelio mansion had never known before. The wound at Gracie's temple slowly healed, leaving behind a faint scar she didn't bother to hide, and she returned to caring for Rosa, who seemed to sense that the storm had passed and became more peaceful than before. But between Gracie and Tommaso, there was still a distance that hadn't been mended, the shadow of the truth about her grandmother still lying there, something that couldn't be erased simply because he had saved her. One evening, Tommaso came to her, and instead of avoiding it, he spoke plainly about everything. He told her about the cost-cutting decisions Bianca had pushed through, about the cold system that had allowed her grandmother to die in neglect, but he didn't use any of it to deny his own guilt. "I didn't directly give that order," he said, "but I created the world that allowed it to happen, and I won't insult you by pretending I'm innocent. I'm not asking you to forgive me, because I'm not sure I deserve it. I'm only asking you to give me the chance to make it right, not with money, but with actions." Gracie was silent for a long time. She thought of her grandmother, of the pain she had carried, and she understood that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, nor did it mean that what had happened had somehow become right. Forgiveness was a choice not to let hatred eat her alive, a way of setting herself free. "I forgive you," she finally said, "not because what happened can be accepted, but because I see that you're truly changing, and because my grandmother wouldn't want me to live with a heart full of hatred. But forgiveness is a beginning, not an ending. You have to prove it every day." Tommaso nodded, receiving her words as though receiving a sentence he was willing to serve, and he began, Not with beautiful promises, but with slow, practical steps. He knew that a man in his position couldn't simply announce that he was leaving everything behind and walk away. The underworld didn't work like that, and a rushed retreat would only create a bloody power vacuum and place the very people he loved in danger. Instead, he began a long and carefully calculated process, gradually moving the family's operations into legitimate businesses. Restaurants, real estate, transportation, cutting away each illegal branch with caution so as not to trigger a violent backlash. He reformed all the care facilities and medical centers under his control, setting new standards for staffing and treatment, turning the very places that had caused tragedy into places where no other family would have to suffer the kind of loss she had endured. He did it quietly, without display, not to redeem himself in front of Gracie, but because he was beginning to understand the true meaning of what she had once told him about respect. Gracie witnessed that change day by day. Not a miracle that turned a crime boss into a saint overnight, but a man wrestling with his former self, stumbling, then standing again, and continuing down an unfamiliar road. She saw him sit for hours with lawyers and accountants instead of armed men, saw him learn how to build instead of destroy, and she understood that this was what true transformation really looked like, not something born in a single emotional moment, but a steady journey chosen again and again each day. One afternoon, while the two of them sat beside Rosa listening to her hum the familiar lullaby, Tommaso gently placed his hand over Gracie's, and this time she didn't pull away. They said nothing about love, didn't need any declarations, only a quiet understanding growing between two people, from two worlds that had once seemed never meant to meet, and both of them knew that although the road ahead was still long and far from easy, they would not have to walk it alone. The following spring, the three of them returned to Calabria together. Rosa, though the illness still clung to her, was strong enough for one final journey back to the place where she had been born, and Gracie and Tommaso brought her back to Santa Lucia del Monte, the small village on the mountainside that both women of the previous generation had once called home. The village was almost unchanged after all those years. Still the same stone-paved slopes, still the church with the leaning bell tower, and in the center, the small square with the old fountain, the very square in the yellowed photograph Tommaso had shown Gracie on that fateful night. They helped Rosa into the middle of the square at dusk, when golden sunlight fell at an angle over the ancient stone walls, and the whole space seemed to hold its breath in an old, familiar peace. Gracie had brought the photograph of the two young girls with their arms around each other's shoulders, her grandmother Lucia and Tommaso's Rosa, the two nightingales of the village who had once stood singing here 60 years earlier, and she placed it in Rosa's hands. The old woman looked at the photograph for a long time, her trembling fingers drifting over the two faces, and though no one knew how much she could still remember, a gentle smile bloomed on her lips. Then Gracie began to sing. She sang the lullaby in the Calabrian dialect, the song her grandmother had passed down to her through so many childhood nights, the song Rosa and Lucia had once sung together in this very place when they were still young girls with their whole lives stretched out before them. Her voice rang clear in the empty square, slipping through the stone alleys, carrying to the windows where a few elderly people stopped what they were doing and looked out, and some of them, old enough to still remember, smiled softly as they recognized the melody from a time long gone. Rosa began to sing along, her voice weak but full, and in that moment, past and present became one. The grandmother who had passed, and the grandmother who was still living, the granddaughter and the aging mother, all joined again by a song that had crossed death, illness, the ocean, and the years. Tommaso stood silently beside them, and the man who had once made an entire city tremble now let his tears fall freely, not from pain, but from a kind of peace he had never known before. He looked at Gracie, the girl who had entered his life from a hidden corner no one had bothered to notice, and had taught him that a person's worth did not lie in the power they held or the fear they spread, but in the kindness they gave and the dignity they kept even when life was at its cruelest. When the song ended, Rosa took both their hands, placed Gracie's hand in her son's, and in one of the final moments of clarity she still had left, she spoke softly in the language of home. Love each other. Don't let loneliness win. And then she rested her head on her son's shoulder, peaceful as someone who had finally come home. It was a blessing they would both carry for the rest of their lives. The story of Gracie and Tommaso reminds us of something simple that we often forget amid the rush of life. That every human being, whether a powerful crime boss or a quiet cleaning woman, deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. Dignity does not lie in the clothes we wear or the work we do, but in the way we treat one another. And sometimes the very people society overlooks carry inside their hearts the kind of light that can heal even the souls we thought had hardened beyond repair. Kindness is never meaningless. Compassion offered to a stranger can return in ways we never expect. And none of us is so alone that we can't be redeemed by sincere love. If this story has touched your heart, please press like, share the video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about this story? And what does it remind you of in your own life? Have you ever been treated kindly by a stranger at the very moment you needed it most? Or have you yourself ever given kindness without expecting anything in return? Please leave a comment sharing your story and the feelings from deep within your heart. We're always listening, and we treasure every line of your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment. May everyone watching this video always have truly good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and a heart filled with love every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.